We're drinking.
John, so my dad's Budweiser when I was like 13.
Okay, that's fair. Good.
Jay.
Hey, Jay. Which one? Bald Duck. Okay. What do you know? What kind of beer Bald Duck is or was? It wasn't made out of duck. Okay.
I had the same.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, it's malt liquor. Okay. What?
I think my dad's Schlitz only when I was about 5.
Yeah, that's a good one. Tom?
Probably Schlitz in Philadelphia.
No kidding. Okay.
John, I can't remember. I was 5. My aunt was giving me sips of her wine in the kitchen while my uncle was giving me sips of his beer in the living room. I spun around 3 times and walked into it.
That's fair. All right. Hi. Your name and the first beer you can remember drinking.
Jesse.
Okay. Jesse, welcome.
Bernie and Valentine out of my dad's beer.
Yeah.
It was terrible.
A lot of dads involved here. Okay, that's good.
And Don and Old Milwaukee.
Yep. Okay. Hi, Kevin.
Cheap beer in college. I don't remember what it was.
Sure. Cheap beer in college. Nate Budweiser.
Jody, and I was 17. I was a freshman in college and got into a bar with my friends on a fake ID.
Fair. Yeah.
Graham, my grandfather had the Guinness bottling franchise for Yorkshire.
All right, folks, we're out. Thanks very much. Wow, did you hear that? Graham, his dad had the Guinness bottling franchise in Yorkshire.
Oh my!
Yeah. So thanks very much for coming out. That's fantastic. No, Andy.
Turn the class over to him.
Yeah, right.
My name's Andy. I'm the brewer here at Havoc. I work with Michael. And my first beer has probably got to be a Leinenkugel's up at the cabin in North Wisconsin, in Spooner.
I'd ask Molly. This is my wife, Molly, but I'm not sure she's ever had a beer. Not a full one. She doesn't drink, and we own a brewery. I'm Michael. I am the owner of Havoc Brewing. Recently acquired the title of Master Brewer. I just literally 2 weeks ago graduated with my master's degree in brewing science. So glad to have you all here. I should say there's a reason he's the head brewer because this is the guy that taught me how to brew beer. Once upon a time in his garage or on his back patio. And it happened because I was visiting his house down in Hickory, North Carolina. I was living in Charlotte. We knew each other from when we served in the Navy together. He had spent a lot of time when we would skive off in the afternoons in D.C. We were at the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, and we would we would go PT. It was exercise, 1, 2. And we would end up at there's a bar in D.C. called the Brickskeller. It's curls. It's great. But I knew nothing about. My first beer was I grew up in Texas. Lone Star beer was about the only thing around, and I can remember having Lone Star beer from the time that I had an uncle, my Uncle Mike. In fact, one of my Uncle Mike's was very fond of Lone Star, and he would constantly hand me his beers to finish, which meant I got all of his backwash, which is super gross. But so I knew nothing. We get to know each other and become friends, and thus began my beer education. And we were visiting each other down in Hickory, and he serves me a beer, and I said, "This is fantastic. What is this?" He goes, "I made it." And I said, choice words, no way you did. And he took me outside and showed me the buckets he was making beer in. They're up there now, but he was making beer in buckets in his garage, and it was delicious. So when I retired from my first career and began contemplating opening Havoc Brewing Company, this is who I wanted to brew our beer. So I'm love to have him here, and I'm grateful for his partnership in this. Yeah.
Just for a little flavor, they are very complementary, not just in their personalities, but also their beer choices. So Andy
That's true.
is more of a purist, wants to make a very good Pilsner, a very good Kolsch.
Very European in his styles.
Wants to throw mango and habanero in it. So
Yeah,
they're
I do.
A very good balance, a very good partnership.
It's true.
And both are perfectionists, which I hope you can tell. We've both
Yep.
been in business 3 months.
Yep.
This is rounds 2 and 3 of professional brewing, and I think they're doing an okay job.
I think so too. Yep. Thank you. Well, I went from buckets to in home brewing. I got to tell you, does anybody home brew? Yeah. Okay. So I would tell you, as a now professional brewer, craft brewing is where it's the incubator of good beer. I mean, that's really where people are coming up with great ideas. West Coast IPA, New England IPA, all of these beers, the really adventurous ones these days, they all come from home brewers, and it began in that sort of realm. I went from buckets to, you can see the machine that's next to Molly there. That was in my garage, and I brewed through the pandemic on that. And because bars and restaurants were largely closed, my garage and driveway became the place in the neighborhood to be, and that's where Havoc Brewing Company was born, in my garage. And I went through a series of deep dives. I mean, as a hobbyist, I started taking problems and learning everything I could about them. So temperature control for yeast, water chemistry, working on mash chemistry, and all that, like just as much as I could learn. And it just became for me this expensive, encompassing passion. So what I want to share with you today, I want to kind of give you an orientation. You're standing amongst a lot of production equipment and a lot of stuff. I want to just give you a brief orientation to what we do, and then talk to you a little bit about some specifics about brewing and a particular part of our science here. So who knows where beer comes from? Cans. Did you say trees? Okay. Grain. Yeah. I mean, it is it's an agricultural product. In fact, North Carolina, the business Secretary of State categorizes what we do as an agricultural manufacturing business. So we are agricultural manufacturers, and we take barley, which is this, and I'm going to pass this around for you. Do feel free, by the way, to take a handful of this and eat it. Keep in mind there are people that have to get all the way over there, so don't take it all. But it's something I encourage you to try. And we'll circle back to the science of what happens in your mouth as we go through. But please feel free. This is unmilled grain. Yeah, you can take a handful of it and eat it. It's a little bit like grape nuts. Anybody had grape nut cereal? Yeah. So farmers grow this stuff. They grow it all over the world. In fact, this is one of the most abundant crops and one of the oldest crops we have. So grain comes through. And as you look at it, notice this is really, I mean, this is when they talk about whole grain cereal, you're not getting the whole grain. This is whole grain. It has a few parts to it. You know, it's got a husk on the outside covering it's a seed, basically. It's got the husk on the outside and then the starch on the inside. And before we can use it, they have to do some things to it to turn it on, is how I'm going to describe it, okay? So if you were to go out into the field and just pull the stuff off and try and make beer with it, it's not going to work. What they do with it is they actually get it wet and they let it germinate for 3 days. And once it sprouts the tiniest little bit, they stop it, okay? What they're doing when they do, and you can kind of see they're cracked open a little bit. This is all just sticking in my hands. It's sprouted a little bit, just a tiny little bit, 3 days worth. And so what they do is then they dry it out. They stop the reaction. They stop germination. That's the word. And then maybe they take it and they cook it. Okay. Depending on how much they cook it, that depends on the color of your beer. So I see you're drinking one of our stouts. That beer has been roasted like coffee. The barley that's inside of it has been roasted like coffee. It's very dark, has lots of coffee flavors to it because essentially you're cooking a lot of the same chemicals in this that you would find in a coffee bean, and so we get a lot of those flavors out of it. All of the color you get in your beer, every bit of it comes from the grain. Comes from the barley.
So what is the malt? What is that for malt?
So the process I just described where they let it start germinating and then stop it, that's called malting. And the reason, so it's called malting because what it's doing inside the grain, and this is, we're sort of beginning to talk a little bit about the science, what it's doing inside the grain is activating enzymes, okay? which is important. We're going to talk about enzymes in detail. Don't get stuck there. But it's activating the enzyme, which helps make sugar. I want the enzyme. That's, in fact, in the barley, that's the most important thing besides the sugar and the color is the enzyme that's in there. And what we do here is really mostly enzyme management. You can kind of think of it that way. So it comes to us. We get bags of it. We get 50-pound bags. You can get it in all kinds of shapes and sizes, but we get 50-pound bags of it. And in order, where's it farmed at? Mostly in the Midwest. Most of our Briesse, which is most of the grain, most of the malt that we get, I should say. So at some point, it stops being grain and becomes malt, technically. So the malt that we get mostly comes from Minnesota, comes from Wyoming, the Midwest, the breadbasket, comes to us through there. We do, a few of our beers, we use some German malts and some European stuff, but by and large, it's coming from all that. Andy's going to start a little science experiment for us while I'm talking, so we'll get to him in a minute. So as it comes to us, what happened when you took it and how many of you ate some? What was it like?
Sweet.
Did it start sweet? No, it doesn't start sweet. But as you crack it with your teeth and your saliva, by the way, you have enzymes in your mouth, those enzymes start to break down those carbohydrates in there and it gets sweet. And the longer you chew it, actually, the sweeter it gets, okay? Which is what we do. So the trick, though, is to get to it. I have to be able to get what's inside of here in such a way that then I can separate the water and the grain from each other. So what I have to do is I have to mill it. So you see the machine that's right there in the corner? We take bags of it and we dump it in. And it runs through rollers. And the rollers, we don't want to make flour. That's one type of milling. What we want to do is just gently separate the outside husk from the inside starch. And great question. So I'm going to pass these around and go this way. So this is milled. Here you go. You can take a look. You can take a look at. So it's sort of been pulverized, yeah. And you can see there is some flour in there. That went through the machine. That went through actually the little machine over there because it'd be too big to go through that. But what we want to do is separate it, but keep the husks. Precisely for the question you asked. Has anybody ever made corn chowder? Made corn chowder? Cornbread? Have you ever taken flour and added to a chili or a soup or something to thicken it up? Okay, when flour and carbohydrates, when starch gets hot, what does it do? It turns into gelatin. It gelatinizes. So when our grain gelatinizes, it becomes really difficult to get what we want out of it, which is sugar and water. We want to be able to pull the sugar water out. But how do you do that, right? So the grain is kind of, it has all the things we need in it. You can be able to, all right? All right. These temperature control. So the grain has everything. The husk we want, because the husk serves as a filter. So when it mixes all in there, and you can see when we're going to add some water, he's just done that there. As you add water to it, the husk itself will serve as a filter for it. Okay? So we run everything through the mill. Oh shit! I figured. Yeah. All right. Yeah, actually. Yeah. I wouldn't worry about the temperature control so much. Just, it's all right. It smells good. So we have an auger. That's just how we do it. One of the things I will tell you about Havoc Brewing Company is, so I'm a disabled veteran. I don't look like it necessarily, but I have back issues, and I really don't like to lift or shouldn't lift more than about 50 pounds. So we've built a system here where we don't really have to lift a lot of things. So we have an auger that takes the grain and runs it, that's that white pipe that goes up there, and drops it into this, yeah, that's how we get it up there. And once it's up there, it's ready to use. And all we have to do is what Andy's doing right now, which is add hot water to it, and it gets mixed up in this. So I've labeled it for you. It says mash. folks often ask what the big silver things are, so I labeled it. This is our hot water tank. That's our cold water tank. Those become important because this is preheated. It's steam heated, and all of that hot water mixes over here. So we'll put in sometimes 1,000, maybe 1,500 pounds of grain goes in there, along with about 650 gallons of water, and we mix it, and then we let it sit and be quiet for about an hour. Okay, and during that hour, we're getting sugar from the starch. So once that's done, and take a moment and just sort of walk through and see what's on the bottom there, and you'll see what's called a false bottom, and it's basically just a sieve. It's a filter that lives in that vessel there, and so the grain sits on top of the false bottom, and then there's a whole section of the vessel underneath it where it collects the sugar water, and then we pump all that out, and that comes over here. So malt goes in, comes up to here, mixes with water, we get our sugar, and then we transfer it over to this vessel here. Once it's here, we boil it, and we add hops to it. Who knows what hops does for beer? Do you know what? Flavor? Yeah. So you're drinking a hazy IPA. There's a lot of hops in a hazy IPA. But funny enough, none of it gets boiled, which is a whole other story I'll tell you later. Say again? Exactly. So we have beer because ancient people were hungry, and they figured out a way to take their grain and make it last through the winter. They can make bread out of it. Bread lasts for a little while, but if you ferment it, it lasts a long time, and it makes you feel good. And because you have to boil it, it's also pure. So water's never been clean. I always laugh when I watch the Coors commercials and they talk about the fresh, the Rocky Mountain water that it's terrible. Like, that's great that they use Rocky Mountain water, but they have to boil it because it ain't clean. I mean, that's the thing. So beer exists because people needed food to last through the winter, and they needed a source of liquid hydration that wasn't going to kill them and cause dysentery. So thank our ancestors for that. It's worth noting, by the way, they knew none of this. It's all accidental. They knew that when they drank it, it didn't kill them, that it felt really good, and that they stayed alive. Like, that's really great. Yeah. It wasn't until Louis Pasteur. Anybody know Louis Pasteur? Okay, we have, what did he discovered what? Pasteurization. Right, but he discovered, the thing is, he learned about pasteurization because he had a microscope and he could see bacteria and he could see small things. And it wasn't until Louis Pasteur in the 1800s, late 1800s, like 1872, that we even knew yeast were a thing. So before that, it's just widely accepted that it was just nature. It's the great mystery. I don't know. It just happens. It's nature. Life is great. That's it. Yeah, Norwegian farmers, when they make beer, they take a wooden ring and they let it float on top of the fermenting beer, and then they take that ring and they throw it on the next batch, and they throw it on the next batch, and they thought it was the wood that fermented the beer. They had no idea. And by the way, who had Budweiser? Budweiser was your first beer. Who was your first Budweiser beer? The Beechwood aged Budweiser. The reason why it's Beechwood aged is because lager yeast comes from beech trees. Nobody knew that, okay? So all of this is sort of like newish for us. But back to where we are. We'll get to the science in a second. So once it comes out of here, we boil it, and then we rapidly chill it, which is a fun process. We can take boiling water from 212 degrees, which is boiling, down to 35 degrees, like in an instant. And what we do is, this is a heat exchanger. We put water in one direction, cold, and we put water in the other, or the sugar water in the other direction, hot. And heat always jumps from hot to cold. So it just takes away the heat of it, and we take it over there. And you see, I've labeled one of our fermenters. I like to tell people, I make sugar, yeast make beer. Okay, so the yeast make the beer over there, and then there's a whole process of getting it clarified and all that. Okay. What's the what? Oh, great question. we spend a lot of time when we make beer keeping it away from oxygen. Oxygen is the enemy of beer, except right before you put yeast in, yeast need oxygen to multiply. So we add pure oxygen as it goes through so that they have something to multiply with. It's one of their building blocks. Okay, so that's the process, right? Malt, mash, boil, chill, yeast. That's all we do, okay? It is, the basic 4 ingredients. You have water, grain or malt of some kind, hops, and yeast. That's what beer is made out of. But none of this matters if we can't figure out sugar, okay? So I need a couple of volunteers, 3 in fact. All right? So you're gonna, it's all right, you can set your beer down. You're gonna need 2 hands for this. I do, I'll need 2 more folks here. So grab here where I'm holding, grab here where I'm holding, and stand just over off to the side. All right. All right. And where to go? Here it is. All right. There you go. Okay. Everybody else, let's slide to this side, and let's get y'all over here. Okay. You guys are yeast. All right. Be hungry yeast for me. All right. Everybody see? All right. So yeast have one job. Okay. They eat sugar. Well, they have 3 jobs. They eat sugar. They make alcohol, and they burp carbon dioxide. That's what they do. So you guys are hungry, but you can't eat this. This is a molecule of what is inside of our grain, okay? It's, in science terms, this is called a polysaccharide, okay? You all have heard of saccharin, right? Saccharin is sugar. This is essentially 3, well, by the way, polysaccharides come in very long chains, so this would go for a mile in one direction, okay? But this is, let me get around you. This is 3 sugar molecules, 3 simple sugar molecules, okay? It's made up, this is organic chemistry stuff, but it's made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, okay? Easy stuff. If you eat this, you're gonna get a tummy ache. You absolutely will. One of the reasons why I encouraged you to chew your grain a little bit was because it's the same thing when you eat broccoli, any kind of cruciferous thing. It's gonna hit your intestines and you're gonna explode because you will also ferment it. Oh. Okay? So the reason, and pardon me for the biology lesson here, but the reason you get gassy is because you also ferment things every day. And so when you take the sugary stuff, the carbohydrates in, any kind of plant material really that has to be broken down. It gets broken down really well. You're good at it, but you have byproducts, and part of that is methane and carbon and other things like that. So you're a polysaccharide, right? You're an enzyme. The enzyme's job is to chop this thing up. Okay. So if I had more time and resources, I would have made one long enough to go around the whole room. Because what you should know about enzymes is this: enzymes only chew from the front to the back. So what they do is they chop it and they chop it and they work methodically down the chain. For some reason, they can only get what's at the very end. That's just how they work. So you're going to be working hard. He's our brewer. And that's right, Statue of Liberty, right? That's it. So the brewer's job in this case is to manage the temperature. That's why he's got the heat source, right? It's not a real heat source, so don't worry about burning yourself. But your job is to manage the heat source. Okay. Have you ever played rock, paper, scissors? Yeah. Okay. Paper beats rock, rock beats scissors, scissors beats paper.
This is fun.
Well, right. But this is that game. Because
If this is too big.
if it's too big, the yeast aren't going to eat. But if you can actually disrupt this process by getting it too hot, okay? You can disrupt this process by you just keep going. You're unstoppable unless it gets too hot. And you just get to live like you are. Right. So, I mean, the challenge here is to find the right equilibrium of all of this, okay? So, what Andy's actually doing, the experiment he's doing for you, is this in a nutshell. What we're doing is creating small mashes at different temperatures, because I want you to taste how the sugar water is a little bit different at 3 different temperatures. So we're doing something at about 130, 135 degrees. We're doing one at 150, 148 degrees somewhere, which is ideal. That's where we want to be. And then we're doing another one at about 175 degrees. You die at anything above 165 degrees, which means if we're on brew day and we have a total brain fart and we let the temperature get way too high, we're going to end up with tea, and it's not very good. Okay. If you're not doing your job and the temperature's too low, we're going to end up, she's going to run riot over the whole thing. And all of these chains are going to be broken, and you're going to end up with something very fermentable and not at all delicious to drink. Because remember, the yeast want to eat all the yeast, right? You guys are hungry. You're going to eat all the sugar. So, as you've been holding that, just a quick question for you. Can you identify the weak spot?
Yes.
There are 2 of them, right?
Right there.
Yeah, right here.
And then right here.
And right here, okay? These 2 hydrogen bonds right here, okay? It's the weakest part, and the fun part is when you put a model like this together, it becomes real in a way. Like as he's holding it, it's obvious that's the weakest part of the structure. And I'm sorry, as ravenously great at your job you are, you're not very strong. So if you're gonna get in there, go ahead and get in there and chop one of those. You have to start at his right hand. Right there, yeah. So you're gonna cut that through. Oh, well, let's all pretend. All right, so I'm gonna take your sugar from you. Okay, don't cut anymore. Where were we? How dare you. All right, so what gets left is, because by the way, we do this for a short period of time. We do it for an hour, okay? If we went longer, we can change various parts of this. We're going to chop up all that because she's going to go crazy, right? But your beer's not going to be sweet. When you drink your beer, everybody's got a beer. Is there some residual sweetness to it? Okay. It's because the yeast, the yeast only want this. And our goal is to give them enough of this to make enough alcohol while leaving enough of that to be sweet, to give flavor and sweetness to the beer. Okay. So who knows? So anybody do organic chemistry? A little bit? Do you know what sugar this is? This is sucrose. Okay. This is table sugar. It's what's called a disaccharide. Okay. It's made up of 2 molecules of sugar, which is right? Disaccharide. 2 molecules of sugar, and you perceive that as sweet. But the moment we throw a 3rd one on there, you can't digest it.
Sorry, what's that?
This is sucrose.
Okay.
You got 1 sucrose, 2 of those is a disaccharide.
Right.
Okay.
If the bond is still.
If the bond is, so there is still a bond here, so that's your disaccharide. That's what you have as table sugar on your tables. It's a disaccharide. This is your simple. You can make this at home. You have to throw a little bit of acid and maybe some baking soda into it, and you can do this the same way as we do with enzymes, but it's not going to be great for beer. So, yeast food, human food is really how it works. And the thing is, to do that,
We can't digest that by itself?
you can digest this all day. In fact, your body prefers to digest this first.
Digest all 3 together.
You can. So, all right. So if it becomes, so if it's what's called a polysaccharide, that's 3 or more, right?
She hadn't snipped it.
If she hadn't snipped it, it's going to go into your gut, and your gut's going to ferment it, and then you'll get what's out of it. But that's what's called a complex carbohydrate. Okay. Anybody eat oatmeal? Okay. This is oatmeal. Okay. This is oatmeal. This and your body knows. Nature is lazy, y'all. Nature is super lazy. You're going to do the simple thing first, and this is so. If you've ever read about the glycemic index, okay, it's because this stuff hits your blood sugar super fast. It's easy to digest. It just goes straight in. You don't have to do anything to it. It's already done. In order to get this into your bloodstream, your body has to cut that bond and then do it. So it takes an extra step. If you do 3 of these, so if you have a longer chain, it's actually much longer, but if you have a longer chain, a polysaccharide, it takes even longer and actually takes some energy to digest. So you can digest it. It's just, it has a different effect on your bloodstream in that way. But yeast are lazy. They prefer to eat this stuff because it's accessible. And nature is lazy by nature. It's not going to expend energy on something it doesn't have to. So by the time it's eaten all of the available simple sugar, the single molecule, they're done. They're ready to go to sleep. They've produced enough alcohol to make the environment. What's that?
This is left.
That's what's left. So we can go ahead and set this down. It's made enough to reproduce. I'll go ahead and take your. Thank you very much. You all were lovely. Give them a round of applause.
But you're trying to kill off that before it slips too much, right?
And so, great. That's a good point. So, at some point, at about an hour, we raise the temperature on this thing. Thank you for. I would have glossed right over that. We raise the temperature up to about 165 degrees, which is uncomfortable, and it denatures the enzyme. The enzyme stops working at that point and leaves us with enough residual sugar that it gives some sweetness and some body to the beer. If you've ever had a beer that tastes thin or watery, it's because they mashed at a lower temperature. If you go to a little bit higher, like 155 degrees, you get a really viscous beer. It's really heavy. In fact, so there are stouts. Stouts are a great example. Guinness, for example, is a dry stout. There's only 120 calories in a pint of Guinness. It's a light beer. Crazy, huh? But that's because they mash. So the color has nothing to do with how heavy the beer is. They mash at a low temperature. The yeast eat up all that sugar, and you're left with something that's a lot less bodied. Go ahead.
Strictly on timing, or do you actually measure the sugar content when you decide to bring it up to boil? The latter?
No.
Done on timing alone?
Well, so as home brewers, I would tell you we measure sugar all the time. At this point, I know what's happening in there, and I know the timing of it. So we could, but we will pull samples at various stages, and we actually measure the content later. Because I'll tell you the truth, once it's in there, we can't really change the pH. We can't really change what's happening. We have different opinions about things sometimes. Do you have things you want to?
You change the pH in there.
Not
Lower it.
possibly. It's
Phosphoric and lactic acid.
no, but on the front end, right?
Oh, yeah.
On the front end. By the time we are at the point of measuring pH in that, the die is cast. We're not really going to make a meaningful change this time, but we can learn something for next time. And so that's why we take these measurements and we do that. So we raise the temperature here, we kill the enzyme, which leaves us with enough sugar to be sweet afterwards.
I thought that we'd stop because of the alcohol content. It stops on temperature.
So that's where I was going. Thank you. So yeast food, it goes over, and they're going to eat everything they can. Who knows anything about rabbits? Rabbits. I know. I just did a whole solid left turn on you, or right turn, or whichever direction that is. Okay. Rabbits will eat and multiply and eat and just keep doing that until they run out of food, and then the colony will collapse. Okay? Yeast do the same thing. They eat as much as they can. They multiply exponentially as fast as they can. In fact, within a day of adding yeast, I should say this. So we talked about the oxygen. The oxygen goes in within a half hour of adding yeast to the what we call it wort, the proto beer. All the oxygen's gone. The yeast have just consumed it all as fast as they can. They work very fast as they're waking up. They do what they got to do. They multiply. They eat everything they can. And by the time they're out of food, they've also created enough of a hostile environment for them that they need to go to sleep and wait. So they just clump together. They huddle for warmth, so to speak. It's called flocculation. They get together, and so as they get together, they get too big and they sink to the bottom. It's great. It's great for us because what that means is everybody. It's like it's beautiful. So what they've left us with their nasty byproduct, they can't do anything with it. The alcohol is not good for them, and they actually most of the yeast we use stop working really well at about 7%, and they for sure stop working at 10%. There's some yeasts that go up to 18%, but we don't use those guys because they make a kind of alcohol that's it's called fusel. It's hot. It's basically what if we were distilling, if we were making bourbon, we would want that. That'd be amazing. But not what we're up to here. Yeah. So anyway, take a look at the fermenter. I'm going to just walk through here. And you can come closer if you want. But this is one of our fermentation vessels. And you'll notice it's different than all of the others because it has this cone here at the bottom. The cone does a lot for us. Of all of the ingredients that we have in our beer, the yeast is by far the most expensive. A first generation yeast costs us about $750. Okay? So the good news is they don't die. Well, they do, but they don't all die, okay? But what they do is they clump together for warmth, as I said, and then they fall down here to the bottom. And the great news is we can collect them, and we can use them again.
It's a sourdough starter.
Basically, we make sourdough all the time, sort of. So this is the beauty of this vessel. There have been lots of ways brewers throughout history have tried to capture the nature that made the beer. They had no idea what it was. When we discovered conical fermenters, changed the whole world. So you'll see on our fermenter here, we have two ports, and this top port has and you can all come and look at some point, but it has an arm in it that we can rotate around, so we can leave behind the stuff we don't want to drink, and we take the really good stuff, the beer, off the top of that. So just so you know, we take it out of here, and we put it into this guy. And as it's in here, and you can see we have some lager in here right now, what it does is this is another place where we just let everything settle out to the bottom. And there's a pipe in there that sits just a little bit above all that slurry that's down in there, and we pull off clear, beautiful, what we call bright beer. So this is called a bright tank. But fermentation, yeast make the beer, and we make it nice and pretty over here. And so the science of this, I don't hesitate to call it science, but it is generational. It's the kind of thing that we've learned for a very long time, how to do and how not to do. But it is kind of an art. My wife, so Molly and I were kind of talking about that, and how Andy and I have changed our perspective on what it is that we do. I want to go back over here because this feels very tight to me. All right. How are we doing? So as a home brewer, I thought of brewing beer a lot like baking. And I love to bake. I bake a lot. I bake my kids' birthday cakes every year. I just bake all the time. I love baking. Baking is chemistry, right? Baking is very scientific. If you add a little bit more baking soda, or you add a little bit more egg, or a little bit more of this, you're going to change the entire thing altogether. Has anybody ever seen those? There's like a poster with cookies on it, and it's all the different ways you can mess up cookies, almost, But they're either like clumpy, or they spread out, or they do, various different things. I mean, baking is really scientific. But when you go to a restaurant and the chef is making, I don't know, what's the chef making? Something, I don't know. Souffle, right? That's a great example. Because eggs, I bet we could go around the room here and everybody wants their eggs a little bit different. I order my eggs over medium every time I can get them. And they're never over medium when I get them. They're just not, because somebody messed up the temperature, right? So brewing beer is more like being a chef than it is being a baker. there are known variables, and we can play with those variables, and we can get different things out of them, and that's what you have in your hands. What temperature are we at here?
That's the low temperature.
So this is low temperature, and it's milky. It's got lots of starch in it. But take a little taste of it and tell me what you think. Yeah, it's
Liquid bread.
liquid bread. Yeah, it's bready, right? It's not very sweet though. I mean, there's some sweetness to it, but there's not a lot of. It's. I wouldn't call it very sweet compared to what I know is coming. Yeah, let's collect up because you don't have to. Tell you what, I'm gonna grab a bucket and you can dump those into the bucket. You can talk. Yeah, drop the whole thing. We'll come back from. There you go. We're clear on that side. All right. What we got? What's next is what we call optimal temperature. And optimal actually is a scientific phrase which means there's a temperature range at which something works ideally. Yep.
It's sweeter.
Oh yeah, significantly. Oh. Yep. Everybody, hear one?
How many more we need?
2.
So this should be sweet, right?
Yes.
Should be.
And mine tastes sweeter, so I hope yours does.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. It's less bready. I'll tell you that.
No. It's well, it's less than an ideal environment. Yes.
Right. So, real quick, as you look at this, what's missing visually? I get that it's cloudy, but yeah, it's not as cloudy as the last one was. It's pale, right? It's because we're using what we call base malt. This is what all beer is mostly made out of. 50% or more is this base malt. Has no color to it, which means it's kind of a palette. It's a blank slate. We can do whatever we want with. Yeah.
It's never been roasted.
No. Nope, not roasted at all. It lacks any character entirely. But so there's a lot of yeast food in here.
Are you roasting it at all?
We don't roast.
You don't roast?
No. No, we don't have the capacity to do any malting.
You buy malters pre-roasted?
Everything's pre-malted, yeah, or roasted. So in the various bags up there, there's different kinds of, and it ranges the whole spectrum of color that we could possibly get. So the last thing we're going to taste real quick is the.
Well, we're not going to taste it just yet. Keep going.
Okay, so the last one we're going to do is the one that started too hot. It's 175 degrees is where we started, ish.
This might be perfect. I don't know.
We'll see.
I don't know if it got hot enough.
Well, see, even when he tries to screw something up, he can't. I mean, that's how good he is.
Good save.
Good save.
If it was too hot, it was.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I'll use you as an example again. So if it's too hot, our enzyme can't do its job. It will not do the thing that it has to do. That's right. So this.
So you won't taste any sweetness and it'll be
No, you'll probably taste a lot of sweetness in this one, to be honest.
Well, let's see.
Theoretically, it would be quite bitter. You're familiar with tannins in wine and tea.
I mean-
You have more of that kind of quality, which are not desirable
Well,
beer flavors.
I think you'll still get the point. This is, to my palate, less sweet than what we just had. It's a lot more like the first one. So one thing I didn't go over at all, but it's worth mentioning. There's something that's in grain that we're not using at all if we don't have to, which is protein. In fact, all of our grain, when we're done with it, we put it in giant bins and we give it to a local farmer, and he feeds it to his cows, and it is perfect animal feed. It has high protein, high fiber, and not a lot of sugar. So they're developing muscle mass instead of fat mass. So his cows are super happy when they get our stuff.
Is that historically correct? Did they used to do that?
Yeah.
Do they do it today?
They bake bread with it. I mean, so there's lots you can do with it. We just don't have a lot of use for it, and it goes bad very fast. So it will within about 48 hours, it will start to compost and turn into nitrogen, and it smells awful. So yeah. Okay, so
And it attracts rats.
what are your thoughts? Yeah, it's not very good. Yeah, it's not good. But yay! But so you kind of get the point, right? The struggle is that dance between time, temperature, and creating what we need out of that. How are we doing with? We're going to do the hops or no? Okay. This is all right here. That's everything that happens in this space. So, interesting part about this though is we will raise the temperature up to no more than about 170 degrees ever. Anything over 170, and you actually, Molly mentioned tannins. So, who drinks black tea or any kind of with tea bag? What you're getting out of tea is tannins. It's that bitter, astringency that it dries out your tongue, and it's not very good. If we raise the temperature too high, we will start to extract tannins out of the grain, and it can ruin beer so quick. You don't want tannins ever at all. What he's setting up for is the last thing we're going to do today, which is we're going to talk a little bit about hops and what hops do, because we've been talking about sugar a whole lot, and what eats sugar? And your kids, bacteria, everything in nature, at least carbon-based life forms, we all eat sugar, which means if we leave out this sugar stuff, even on the floor, if we don't get rid of it or preserve it in some way, then it becomes food for pathogens, it becomes food for bacterium, and sometimes we want that. Has anybody had our sour beer? Yeah. So the process for making sour beer is one of intentionally spoiling a batch. We take all of that, we extract the sugar, we bring it over here, we boil it for all of 5 minutes. Usually we boil for an hour, but we boil it for 5 minutes just to sterilize the batch. We cool it down, and then we add bacteria to it. It's called lactobacillus. It's not a terrible bacteria. You all eat it every time you have yogurt. It's great. But lactobacillus makes an acid that makes it taste sour, tangy, right? Like a sweet tart. So that's sometimes you want to do that, but never in finished beer. So we talk about our brewery in terms of hot side and cold side. Everything on the hot side gets sterilized with every brew batch. It just, because of heat, we pasteurize it quite literally all the way through. Once it gets to the cold side, everything on the cold side has to be chemically sterilized before we add any sugar water, any beer, anything to it. Because if we send all of that delicious sugar water over there without some kind of protection, it's not going to last very long. So what Andy's doing is he's putting together what's called a hop tea, okay? And I want you to have just a taste of hops as a separate ingredient so that you can understand what it does for the rest of the beer. In our beers, everyone, so you had the hazy, who's had an IPA recently? So, well, there you go. Our IPAs have hundreds of pounds of hops in them. Go ahead and pass that around. That's just the bag that the sample came out of. Hops are a plant. There's an acid in the plant that we like a whole lot. The acid works in lots of different ways, depending on if you use it hot or if you use it cold. But the main purpose of hops in a beer is to create some kind of chemical barrier that keeps all the nasties from eating your hard-earned product. Okay, so the beer that we have that has the very least amount of hops is the one I'm drinking. This is our Mexican lager. There's almost, I mean, it's an embarrassingly absent. There's just no hops in this beer. It's not bitter. All the way up to our Imperial IPA, which has, again, hundreds of pounds of hops in it. So what the acid does is it lowers the pH, and it serves as like an antibacterial, as well as add flavor. If we didn't use hops, what else could you possibly use? Think of something that has acid in it. Did you say liquor? Oh, vinegar. Vinegar. So vinegar is acetic acid. You could use that, but it's not delicious. It's pickled, quite literally. They are. You can get pickled beer or picklebacks. I don't recommend them. You could use citrus. So there are some cultures that took citrus fruit and soaked the rind, especially in their beer, to pull out acids to preserve their fermented product. I wouldn't call it beer. They call it something else even. In Africa, they don't make beer with barley. They make it with sorghum. And they use a lot of local, say again? And millet, thank you. By the way, if we were ever to create a gluten-free beer, it would have to be with sorghum and millet.
My nephew, the homebrewer, made me a gluten-free beer.
Yep.
And it was actually,
It's okay.
but it
Yeah,
was sorghum and millet. and
That's right.
One other something in rice.
those ingredients are available to us. They're not widely used, and I have no experience with them whatsoever, which is why we don't have one on our menu. So you can use citrus products, but hops like to grow in places where it's warm. So Germany works. Germany works great. The Pacific Northwest works. New Zealand works really well. In fact, we use a lot of hops from New Zealand. But if you're a Norwegian farmer and you have a growing season that's maybe that long and you need calories, you're going to focus on something you already have, which is barley, which is great. And you're not going to plant a crop that's going to take away the space you need. So Norwegian farmers didn't use a lot of hops. They used spruce. They used pine trees. Just the tips, the soft tips from the edge of. They would go and collect as they budded in the spring, and they would toss those in their beer. And interesting enough, in the United States, during the colonial era, before we actually had a reliable supply of hops, colonial brewers would also use spruce tips. You can use other things. What is the beer from Tobacco Wood I like a whole lot has juniper. So you can use juniper tips, or you can use the juniper berries. So people have been using all kinds of things for years and years. So what are we up to?
I'm just waiting 3 minutes on the...
Yep. So he's putting together the tea over there. You can see, it's green and it's gross. It's sludgy, and I should tell you. So in here, when we're done with a brew day, what we're left with is a mess. It's a lot of hops that collect in there, proteins that have made it over this far, coagulate and gather up in there. It is super duper gross. And
A science-based approach hasn't covered some of these things in our look covers. Brewing is 90% cleaning. So brewers often become less fan of brewing, or people who love to homebrew don't want to carry it forward as a passion, because 90% of what they do is they clean before they brew, they clean while they brew, they clean after they brew. They have to get the waste product out, in this case to farmers. They have to get it off your floors. It's sticky, it attracts rodents, it attracts all the things, all the nasties.
Yep.
So 90% of what they do is cleaning. And
Yep.
that's an important thing to know as you head into the business, which they already did, because they're going to mention the perfectionist factor in their home brewing. They were already doing it. It also really impacts the flavor of your beer.
Oh yeah.
If you've ever had a beer somewhere and it tastes a little funky,
Yep.
they may not have cleaned their tap lines. They may not have been as meticulous somewhere along the line. One of the reasons our brewery is designed the way it is, where that cold box, which we we haven't shown you yet, but the cold box, the kegs are right against the wall where the taps come
Right.
through. That means we have a very short tap line, which means we have very short tap lines to clean. So
Right.
one, it helps us with keeping things clean, and two, it means we don't waste as much beer.
I'll tell you.
And regularly, we don't want to be purging out a ton of sellable product.
Yeah. So if you're at a bar or a restaurant, and you see they have on the front side of their bar one of those nice long things with taps on it, where the bartender can look at you while they're pouring a beer. It's entirely likely they have very long tap lines that go under the concrete and around to some room in the back, and it's probably 100 feet of line that goes through there. So 100 feet of line is 6 pints of beer. So think about this from an economic standpoint. If you're a bartender and you have to purge those every week and clean out, and some of these places have 30 tap lines, right? You're pushing that beer right into the garbage along with whatever money you were going to make off of it. So they probably don't clean their tap lines as often as they should.
The cleaning product one time.
Oh. If that ever happens here, please let me know right away, because I will.
I see guys throw alcohol over here.
So let's talk. So we use spray isopropyl alcohol. We use as a contact sanitizer. Whenever specifically make a connection on hoses or anything like that, we sanitize both ends and the gaskets and all that when we make that connection. That's what we use that for. When we clean our tanks, we use an alkaline-based. It's really sodium hydroxide, to be honest with you, almost lye. That cleans protein matter and all the gunk off. Lye. It's lye basically. Yeah, and we have a tank of it in the back. So we use that, but it's diluted considerably. In fact, it's like 1:60 ratio so 1 part sodium hydroxide to 60 parts water is what we do. So very diluted. Yep. So you can SantaClean. There's also like an OxyClean type product that you can use. Starsan is a version. Starsan, we don't use Starsan because it foams a lot, and I can't deal with that. We use something called peracetic acid, which is actually vinegar with hydrogen peroxide mixed together. So you get the oxidation effect of the peroxide. There we go. Oxidation of the peroxide, and then the acid kills all the beasties. What we clean our tap lines with is there's a commercial tap line cleaner, and I'm embarrassed to tell you I don't remember the chemical that's in it. But what it does is it pulls say again?
It's a really heavy-duty alkaline.
Yeah, it's an alkaline. It's not sodium hydroxide, but it's an alkaline that way, and it pulls all the protein and all the. There's something called beer stone that is. It's a lot like what happens when you. We don't have hard water here, but anybody who's ever lived in a hard water place, like your hot water heater, you get that calcium buildup. There's a similar kind of thing that happens with beer that leaves like a buildup that we clean out with that material too. So everything, by the way, everything we put down the drains, all of those chemicals go straight down the drain and they go to the Pittsboro place. But we put everything down in such a way that it's salt by the time it gets there. It self-neutralizes. So we've had a conversation. We know what the local water treatment plant needs from us and all that. And they also know that they're getting a lot of extra protein and just solid material down their way. But they're more than happy to take it. It's easy to clean out.
So you're using Pittsboro town water?
Yes, ma'am.
I see you've got water treatment over here. What are you
We do.
doing to the incoming water?
Yeah. So, say again? No. Here's what I want to tell you. Well, and you all probably know this because you live around here. Pittsboro, Burlington sends down some nasty stuff through the Haw River that you can't filter it out and you can't boil it out. The boiling point of the 1,4-dioxane is like 214 degrees, which is just above water's boiling point. So you can't boil it out. So I pay attention to when those releases happen, and we store enough water that we can just not take any for a little bit, so that we can skip over some of those poisonous slugs that come down the river.
something.
Yes, so if you peek between the hot water and the cold water tank, you'll see two giant black filters. So we have we filter out for sediment, we filter, there's carbon, and then we do a polishing filter on the other side of that, that pulls out, I mean, it's not reverse osmosis, but it's pretty darn close. And so, well, that's the thing, we actually want the mineral content from the water. The yeast need it. The hops really need it, not that they're living or anything, but you really need to have some kind of chemical content to your water.
If you tried to do it with distilled water, it wouldn't work, or
Yeah.
it would taste terrible.
It would taste terrible. Yeah. So a good beer has a nice balance of, you need sulfites and chlorides especially. So we add gypsum. I mean, it's not drywall, but it's like, I mean, gypsum. It's, you know, we buy a food safe. It's yeah. So we add gypsum and we add calcium chloride. We add sometimes lactic acid to balance pH and things like that. Occasionally we'll throw in some Epsom salt. Occasionally we'll throw in, trying to think of what else we have over there.
And this is all what you do in the water before you put it in.
That's so we call those brewing salts. And what that does is it creates a, so brewers like to talk about, we romanticize water. The Rocky Mountain Spring, that's great. Actually, Raleigh, North Carolina, like what comes out of Lake Jordan, the surface water at Lake Jordan, which the Hob River flows into amongst others, but the water we have here to brew with, besides the poisonous stuff, it's actually, well, I hate to say it, I'll get back to that in a sec, but the water we have to brew here is ideal. It has a perfect chemical and mineral content to it. It makes great beer without almost having to do anything to it. We play around with the balances because in a hoppy beer you want more of something, or so we play around with them. But going to Guinness, I mean, so the water they make Guinness with has a specific profile to it, and wherever they make Guinness around the world, they're going to make it with that same water profile because that's what makes Guinness taste the way it tastes. So, so did y'all have hops? Are y'all drinking hop tea? I haven't had one. Yeah. So hops has a popular cousin. Does anybody know what hops' popular cousin is? It's cannabis. Yeah, hops and cannabis are of the same family and probably split at some point and diverge. So when you smell it in this form, it smells like that Beach Boys concert I went to with my parents when I was 8. So it has a flavor to it. But all of that same character is what goes into your beer at a very different concentrated level. I mean, this is very concentrated stuff. So, it's bitter. It's gross. Have you ever? Oh God, why did I do that? I don't regret many things in life, but that's one for sure.
He's been covering the basics. Do you have any questions?
That's a great question.
About
I can listen.
Process,
I could talk all day.
He can't.
I can and will.
So what? And by the way, is this how you thought beer was made? Anybody have preconceived ideas that this confirmed or?
It's a surprise.
Upside down?
Make any beer with cannabis?
Not allowed to in North Carolina yet. Not yet.
Wicked Weed. In Asheville.
I don't think they make a beer.
It's called wicked weed, but they may use hemp.
Yeah, hemp. Yeah,
Can't use marijuana.
I haven't gotten there yet.
The website says it's the same thing, except for tiny differences.
There are interesting things you can do. I've only ever had one cannabis beer in my life, and I did almost the same thing as I did just now when I spit it out. It's one of the only beers I've ever handed back to a bartender and said, no, thank you. It was not good. So I'd have to find one that I liked a whole lot and emulate it. Have you had one you've enjoyed?
I've had some with that.
Yep. Yeah,
I guess it's like, okay, there's so many kinds of hops.
that's right.
And they're going to do different things. So
That'd be my guess too.
say in Maui, wow, benefit.
That's
Well, you have all these smaller,
yes. Yes, so this is our experimental test kitchen. We can brew, so that is what's called a 1 barrel, or so 31 gallons of beer we can make there.
Her name is Brunhilde,
It's Brunhilde.
and I got my garage back.
Yes, she got her garage back because it all lives here now. We have I should also mention we have a Viking thing going. So this is, and you can see they're labeled. This is Thor. This is Loki. These two don't have names yet. But then as you go down, we have Frida and Hilda and Inga and Gertrude and Gertie's the big girl. Something, yeah. But we specifically did male names over here, and those are all Viking warrior women over there. So, yes. So these are this is a 15 barrel system. So this brews 15 times more than those do, which is 465 gallons at a time. And that's those, and then that's even double that. So that's a 30 barrel fermenter. Well, great. That's a great question. So you can see we have extra kegs here. We're beginning to distribute a little bit. You can find us and we're sort of beginning to concentrically go beyond, but we have a lot currently in Chapel Hill, and then pushing out towards Apex and Cary, that area. We're beginning, those boxes there are full of what we call crowler cans, which are 32 ounces, 2 pints in a can. We have those for sale on the gift shop. But this week, in fact, I was working with our marketing folks. We're designing 2 can labels for our Mexican lager, one for our Mexican lager and one for our hazy IPA. And what happens is we're going to have there's a mobile canning unit. They will come pull right up in here on a trailer. They'll hook up to our stuff. They'll can it up and put it on pallets. And then Lowe's Foods already wants us on their shelves, and Harris Teeter, Lowe's and Harris Teeter. And we have done a tap takeover at that the new Lowe's over there. The goal is to sometime in maybe a year and a half or 2 years open another tap room somewhere. I don't know where.
Where's the carbonation come in?
I like that question. There are 2 ways we can carbonate. Natural carbonation, because yeast burp CO2. And we can force carbonate our beer. And we do a little bit of both. So when the yeast are almost finished, and we do a daily sugar test, so we can watch as they eat the sugar and we can tell what's left over. As they get within about 1 or 2% of being done, we close the valve on the tank. So our tanks they're not open to the air, but there is a way for the excess carbon dioxide to get out because they make a whole lot of it. When they get pretty close, we shut the valve off and we capture inside of the tank the carbon dioxide that's there. So we get a little bit of dissolved carbon dioxide that way. But when we move it over to the bright tank, we pressurize it with carbon dioxide and it dissolves into, and so there's some science behind that, but yeah, we add it. So it's a little bit of both. We add some and it's there naturally too.
How do you control the size of the bubbles? I've noticed some beers I get smaller bubbles and get a head on them real quick, and
Yeah.
others have larger bubbles.
So this is one of my favorite debates. One of the first debates Andy and I had about natural carbonation versus forced carb, and do they make different bubbles? I have an opinion, and I'm happy to be wrong about if somebody can show me, but dissolved gases are the same size because molecules don't change based on where they come from. So what I think you're experiencing when you get a beer that has a lot of foam to it is it has been over-carbonated. So for example, in that tank over there at 38 degrees, which is where we keep it, we add about 15 pounds of pressure to it, and that gets our beers mostly where we want them to be. If I put 30 pounds of pressure on it, I'm going to force a lot more carbon dioxide into that beer, and then when you take it off the tap, it's going to come out.
So it's not the size of the bubbles, it's the quantity of CO2 that's all hidden.
That's right. I mean, so you've had fudge. Yeah.
I mean, I've
Well-
seen in natural carbonated champagne, the bubbles are smaller, less expensive champagne is bigger.
Okay.
If you have a
Yeah.
soda stream and you try to
Yep.
carbonate anything other than water,
Yep.
it'll paint your ceiling.
Okay. So what you're experiencing there is something called nucleation.
Yes, nucleation.
Nucleation. So the reason why, so beer has more nucleation points in it, which means you get tinier bubbles.
Oh, is that it?
The molecules are the same size. It's just how they collect on a thing. So there's a lime floating in mine. A nucleation site is an imperfection or a solid substance that they can collect on. The only reason it rains is because there's particles in the air that the rain collects on and then drops. Okay, that's a nucleation point. So beer has more nucleation points in it than champagne does. Champagne, there's no grain that goes into it. You don't have all of this protein and all this other stuff. Champagne is just straight fructose. You know, it's
Well, I just wonder what the
yeah,
difference was.
it's sugar.
I tried to carbonate, I think it was a Chablis.
Yeah.
You can still see it on the ceiling. Like I said, it just blew right out of there. I was,
Looks like a crime scene, but up there. Yeah.
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 Yeah. It was popcorn ceiling, so it's
Oh. Yeah. And then it kept dripping because it had nucleation points up there to drip off of. This is good.
yeah, you've seen
Yeah.
it before, I'm sure,
I might have done it once or twice.
to do it, but I didn't know why.
That's fair.
It was very clear.
That's funny.
That I should have done.
We were very fortunate to get design help. So you'll notice that we have a few places for fermenters that have
Yep.
not been plugged yet. So
Yep.
we have room to brew because the choke point in brewing, they could do this twice a day. They could do 2 batches a day. It would
Yeah.
work out pretty tired. They could do that. But then you run out of fermentation space and then it needs to be in there for a period of time for the yeast to do its thing.
Right.
And that could be days, it could be weeks, it could be
Months.
So
Yeah.
that's the choke point.
Right.
So over time, we, instead of having some stock production to add more plumbing or drill holes in floors, jackhammer up floors, we added, based upon the good advice of our brewing friends, the
Expansion
capacity to
points.
expand. So we
Yeah.
spent a little tiny bit of money here so that we can add more.
Yep.
You got it.
Yeah.
So every beer you serve
Yeah.
for all beers has a specific recipe. So do you have to be exact with those?
Well, as the scale goes higher in terms of quantity, the margin for error grows as well, which is it's the dirty little secret. Don't let anybody know. So at the homebrew scale, in that machine, when I'm brewing 30 gallons, a difference in grain, like the percentages matter in a way that they don't matter here, which isn't to say they don't matter at all, but the margin for error here is a whole lot higher in terms of the recipe. It's the same margin of error for temperature and all the stuff we talked about with the sugar, but if we happen to throw another ounce or pound or even 10 pounds of a different kind of grain in there, the most difference that's going to make to the recipe is maybe a slight color change, but you're not really going to notice it, and a little bit more sugar to work with, which means, to be honest, you get a little more alcohol out of that. We have an IPA on tap right now. It's called Prophecy West Coast. It's part of what we call our fault lines. We don't really call it that, but it's a mistake beer that came out just fine, and so we market it, we sell it. It's a good beer. I like it. But it was supposed to be a different beer. And on brew day, we ended up putting 3 extra bags of grain into the recipe, which means we got a whole lot more sugar to work with. So it was a higher alcohol beer. And the color was a little bit darker than we had intended it to be. But it's still a great beer. I mean, so sometimes, and this is why it's more like cooking than it is like baking, because what comes out the other side is still beer. Yeah, yes, sir.
What's the alcohol content?
And this?
No, in the one that you're sorry.
6.5-ish?
Yeah, 6.5. And
Yeah.
it was meant to be a 5% beer. And what happened that day was I ended up misreading the list.
I wasn't going to out you.
That's fine. It's still a delicious beer. But we ended up putting in about 50% more grain in.
Yeah. Yeah. And more grain means more sugar. What's that?
What night are you selling it?
Yeah, and there is and I'll tell you there is a point at which I wouldn't sell it if like there's a standard for us.
Delicious beer.
Yeah, that's the thing.
It's just what I intended to make.
Right.
I didn't make. I made this other delicious thing.
Okay. It is a serendipity. Say again. Yeah.
I know what I did.
Yeah.
So it's
repeatable. We intended to make what's called a session IPA, which is a 4.5-5% lowish alcohol. I mean, still 4.5. A beer that you could drink a whole lot of and keep drinking. And we ended up with something that was a little more bitter, a little more alcohol, and still delicious. So what happened is that instead of fitting into this category, it shifted over to just a different category. And the truth is there are like 35 or 36 different categories of like what we call beer styles. And so the recipes are, as I said, every beer is mostly 50% or sometimes more what we call base malt. It's the stuff you tasted, has no color, very little color anyway. It comes out kind of like this color. And then we add roasted or something that's been malted a little longer. I mean, so we play with the flavored ingredients in percentage. That's the recipe, is that percentage of other stuff.
So we're talking about grains.
Grains.
Other than malted barley.
So great question. Malted barley is almost across the board. I'd say we buy 90% of our grain bill is barley. We occasionally use wheat, but not very often. In fact, I think the only beer we have with wheat in it is our wheat beer. We have corn. So we use it's a flaked corn. So they can do to corn the same thing they do with oats and run it. So you've had your Quaker oats that's flat and rolled. We get rolled corn, but it's called, what's the corn called? Flaked maize. Yeah, so it's flaked. And
Isn't that malted as well?
it's not malted. We don't want it. They don't do a malting process on that, but it doesn't have its own enzymes. So we have to rely on the barley's enzymes to actually break some of that down. And the problem with corn, and I used corn as an example earlier, because corn gelatinizes. And so if you used to, in fact, the very first time we made this beer, the Mexican lager, Havoc Actual, it was not the first beer we made, it was the second beer we made. And it gelatinized so hard that we couldn't get anything out. So we were learning right away, like how to solve problems. Like there were some moments. Yeah.
The Navy came out of them.
For sure. But we learned how to fix that on this system, and we got a great beer out of it. So there's always something to. It does, yeah. So in fact, a lot of Mexican lagers, light beers, we use corn in those beers, especially because you almost only get simple sugars out of it, which means you're feeding the yeast a lot, and you get a nice, dry, crisp product at the end. Yeah. Yeah. And no color. Right. Well, it's also the reason why when you want to make moonshine, for example, and I'm not suggesting that you do, but if you were going to make moonshine, it's corn liquor. You're using corn, you gelatinize it, you add some enzymes to it, and you pull off the sugar, and life is great for those people doing it. Say again?
It's in a song, Rocky Top, right?
Oh, Rocky Top, that's exactly. Precisely. Yes, sir.
Do you ever do any nitro beers?
Yes, sir. Nitrogen's a weird one, but our stout is technically supposed to be nitro stout. We had to abandon that because it wasn't coming off the tap the way we wanted to, so we went in a different direction. The problem with nitrogen is it doesn't like to dissolve in liquid. It just doesn't. So you have to really force it to do it. So most nitro beers have a little bit of nitrogen and then more carbon dioxide. And so when you pour it off the tap, you get a little bit of both.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you ever make IPAs with nitro IPAs?
Oh, I love nitro IPAs. Yes, there will be a nitro IPA. There will be. I love a nitro IPA. They're so good. And that's interesting, going to the question the gentleman had earlier. Nitrogen does make smaller bubbles because it's a different molecule, and so when you get a nitrogen beer, it's creamier. It has a different way of. And the brilliant part of that is if you take something like an IPA, which is very bitter, and you run it through a nitrogen generator and you pour it off that way, what you get is something a lot less bitter, and it's just more easy drinking. I've talked long enough that I've the GoPro is out of business. So.
You're always welcome to get a taste.
Yeah.
So our bartenders and servers challenge them. We always want them to be able to answer questions about what they like or tell them what you like and be able to make recommendations.
Yep.
If you want a taste of something, you're welcome to. We can also do flights. We do 4 or 6 beer flights, which give you a chance to really kind of do that same thing, a lighter to darker taste. And especially if I know I like this, but you're willing to try something different, a flight is a great bridge option to trying some new things.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Who wrote the copy?
Who wrote what?
Who wrote the copy? The descriptions. Because we came from like
Tell them.
and the copy was involved.
I wish you hadn't asked that question.
He's gonna share his secrets.
All right. If I tell you, you have to promise not to tell anybody. All right. ChatGPT. It was written by AI, and so we have programmed a persona to ChatGPT that writes beer descriptions for us.
And sometimes comment response.
Yeah, we do other things through it's just fun. But we went through a lot of them, and at some point I told ChatGPT, if you're not familiar, it's an artificial intelligence program online, and I told it to write it like it was angry at the world, and it came back with this beautiful copy. Like, it's not what we put in there, but it's pretty close. It's fun. It's a lot of fun. So I'm going to call timeout only because time is a thing, and we all need to do other things. But by the way, I'm just grateful for a number of things. But for you all to come and spend your time listening to me, listening to Andy and I talk about our passion for this thing, it means a lot to me. And thank you for coming, and thanks for coming to Havoc, and thanks for making Pittsboro what it is. It's a lot of fun here. Yeah. Thank you all. Thanks for coming out.
You gonna be around a minute?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I got a tab.
Okay.
I got a tab open out here if anybody wants another beer.
It's good to know.
And we got away from the topic talking about carbonation.
Yeah.
Do you ever reclaim any of the natural carbonation to then feed it back for forced carbonation, or is that just lost into the air?
It's lost in the air.
Yeah.
I looked at CO2 reclamation as an option, and they make them, but for a brewery of our scale,
It's a lot more
it's very expensive. It was like $100,000,
Oh.
and
it's just
well, and the thing is, I actually have. I mean, I'm conscious of greenhouse gas emissions, things like that, carbon emissions.
where I was
No,
going. I was just
but
curious.
it was a thing that I for a couple of reasons, because when we were building, there was a CO2 shortage,
Yeah.
and I mean, we make more CO2 than we can use here, and it was like, what can I do? So CO2 is already expensive, but I couldn't make the business case for putting in $100,000 of CO2 reclamation. I'd love to. There's a brewery in Maui, strangely enough, for the news these days. The whole brewery is large. It's called Maui Brewing Company. Everything is solar. They reclaim all their CO2. It is. I mean, they're so environmentally sustainable that it's tremendous. One of the things we do that I'm pretty proud of. So over here.